well, what is the scientific method? We observe stuff with our senses or extensions with technological instrumentation, and then we measure as precisely as we can what we're observing, and then we can translate that into mathematics and build models to make predictions, and the better the predictions, the more confident we are that the model is reflecting something real out there in nature. That's all fine and good, and the scientific method is very powerful, but the deeper question is not just a sort of epistemological or methodological question. It's a question of the cosmological conditions that make conscious agents capable of science possible.
Matt, I've focused this podcast around your paper, Physics Within the Bounds of Feeling Alone. And wonderful paper, beautiful read, really enjoyed it. I really like the way you're able to tell such a deep philosophical story. And one of the questions I often ask guests on the show is to do that. It's to start off by giving me a brief philosophical history of the mind-body problem. It's a tough question because it all comes down to their understanding of it all. But from your side, if you had to give me a summary of your understanding of the mind-body problem and its history, what story would you tell?
Well, we should probably go back to the ancient Greeks, though I think even prior to what's often thought of as the birth of Western philosophy in ancient Greece, we could think just in terms of the more or less animist worldview that many primal peoples on every continent held, which obviously did not separate mind and body, but saw what we now call mind as permeating the living and even what we would call the non-living world. Though I think for the primal imagination, there was nothing that was non-living. In some sense, for this earlier phase of human beings, in this earlier stage of the evolution of consciousness, it wasn't life that was mysterious to them. It was death, right? And so one of the distinguishing features of human beings, though it's apparent that other species also recognize death, but human beings seem to build up really elaborate cultural rituals around death. It's a mystery to us. If the universe seems pervaded by life, the fact that our bodies should decay and the at least visible, tangible presence of a person should disappear, that was a problem for these primal peoples. If you fast forward, though, I'll come back to the ancient Greeks in a second, but if you fast forward to, say, the modern period and the rise of this kind of mechanistic science out of Western Europe, all of a sudden it's not death that's mysterious anymore. Death becomes the rule and life becomes a mystery in need of explanation. So something clearly shifted over the course of human prehistory and history. And I think if we go back to the ancient Greeks, before Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, you had what were called the physiologoi, these philosophers who tried to understand nature in terms of some kind of elemental principle. Either everything's all fire, or everything's water, or everything's air. And there wasn't yet a real distinct sense of that elemental power at the base of nature being devoid of mind. It was an expression of mind in a sense. And the ancients would have a sense of the humors of the body corresponding to the elements of nature. And so there was this deep sense of resonance between interior experience, qualitative experience, and the tangible, external, kind of extended world. In Plato, in a dialogue like the Timaeus, you begin to see what we would nowadays call dualism starting to emerge. Though I wouldn't say Plato is simply a dualist. It's more like in his dialogues, he's exploring and dramatizing a whole variety of different positions, one of which is dualism. So in the Timaeus, his cosmological and cosmogonical dialogue, you've got the nous or the intellect or the demiurge shaping the receptacle, or what we could just call materiality, according to the model of these eternal forms. And so you're starting to get this separation between mind and body, right? Active mind that's providing the form, and then passive materiality that's just receiving that imprint. And then Aristotle, this gets systematized into a kind of account of what he calls hylomorphism, or what has since him been called hylomorphism, where you have form and matter coming into a composite relationship. You never get one without the other, really, in Aristotle. And so again, we're not quite to the stage of a radical dualism between mind and body yet. That doesn't happen. I'll skip a couple thousand years and just go to, say, Descartes. The sense of a dualism between thinking activity, or res cogitans, and extended matter gets codified and reified by René Descartes. And the rest of modern philosophy is a struggle to come to terms with that separation. Some go in the more materialist direction, others go in the more idealist direction, but both those positions in the modern period after Descartes are very much, following in his wake, accepting the premises of his mind-body dualism, and just trying to either side with mind as more fundamental or matter as more fundamental. And so, really in contemporary consciousness studies and cognitive science and neuroscience, what gets called the hard problem of consciousness, and some people don't accept that framing because they're just more materialists and think there isn't a real problem there. But all of these debates in our time, I think, are very much just rehashing the same problems that these early modern philosophers, from Descartes through Spinoza and Leibniz, were dealing with. We haven't actually made much progress. We're still very much living in the shadow of Descartes, I think, in terms of the contemporary scientific attempt to understand the mind-body problem and resolve it. So taking this larger view of the development of the issue, I think, is very important, because when you do put modern scientific understandings of nature and the attempt to scientifically understand consciousness in the broader sweep of history, you see how actually rare and abnormal is this little stretch of history over the last few hundred years compared to tens of thousands of years where, animism was the basic assumption of every group of human beings across the planet. So that's basically how I see it.
It's a beautiful story, and I think it's, to me, one of the best topics to explore. And I think you share the same passion with it. What I did was, for your paper, I broke this down into 5 chapters. Hopefully we can get through all of them. If not, there's always time for a round 2. But I think let's start off with what I call chapter 1, critiquing physicalism and its limitations. Your paper critiques contemporary physicalism that still operates within I think what you called a Cartesian Kantian dualism, if I recall correctly. But how does this bifurcation limit our understanding of reality?
Well, it creates a framework wherein we're attempting to understand nature as though we, as the knower, weren't part of it. And that's more of an implicit assumption, because obviously, I pick on Sean Carroll, the physicist, in that particular article. But many physicalists and materialists, of course, would say, well, the human mind is part of nature, no doubt about it. It evolved like any other. We evolved like any other species of animal. But when it comes to scientific explanation, there's still this sort of view from nowhere assumption that we don't need to account for the conditions of possibility of scientific knowledge itself. Let me unpack what that means. Obviously, scientists who do a little bit of philosophy of science will have some epistemological account of, how it is that scientific knowledge is possible in terms of, well, what is the scientific method? We observe stuff with our senses or extensions with technological instrumentation, and then we measure as precisely as we can what we're observing, and then we can translate that into mathematics and build models to make predictions. And the better the predictions, the more likely, the more confident we are that the model is reflecting something real out there in nature. That's all fine and good, and the scientific method is very powerful. But the deeper question is not just a sort of epistemological or methodological question. It's a question of the cosmological conditions that make conscious agents capable of science possible, right? And so the way that I frame it in that article, I'm borrowing, some ideas from Friedrich Schelling, who's thinking in the aftermath of Kant, and asking this question: if we say the mind emerges from nature, okay, but what must nature be such that mind could emerge from it? And Schelling finds it incredible, impossible to believe that nature could have been fundamentally devoid of anything like mind, but that there must have been somehow nature must have been seeded with mind already from the get-go, and the process of evolution is a kind of a growth of that seed into the flower or the fruit of conscious agency. And science then is, it might sound kind of trite or cute or whatever, but science becomes the universe's way of knowing itself. Even Carl Sagan would phrase it that way. And putting science back into and scientific knowledge back into nature, I think is a far more radical proposition than the flippant attitude that physicalists have that, oh yes, of course, mind emerges from and evolves out of nature. If you really want to ground science in nature, that actually requires us to view nature in a certain way, right? Before we even begin to scientifically investigate it, we have to view nature as having been capable of producing us. And I don't think enough consideration is given to the implications of that way of framing the problem.
Was there any particular reason you chose Sean Carroll to have this conversation with in the paper? I was curious.
Well, among physicists, he's actually far more conversant with some of the major issues in philosophy related to philosophy of physics and philosophy of mind. And, he's willing to engage philosophers in dialogue, and he's very respectful of philosophy. I disagree with him philosophically, but nonetheless, he felt like a worthy sparring partner, as it were. And I've actually heard from someone who was at a conference that he did, I think, in New York with Philip Goff a couple of years ago, who printed out this article and gave it to Sean Carroll. I haven't heard from Sean. I don't expect to, but it's possible he read it and was not convinced. But I figured he would be a good sparring partner. Yeah.
Do you think that, because I think Sean is a many worlds theorist, eh? If I'm not mistaken. Do you find that many worlds theorists versus those with Copenhagen views, the ones with many worlds are a little bit more open-minded to these philosophical discussions, or the reverse? This is just
sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I find the many worlds interpretation to be metaphysically extravagant in the extreme. I mean, talk about ontological overflow and chucking Occam's razor. I mean, Sean would say, well, we're just saying the wave function is reality. That is Occam's razor. But ontologically speaking, to multiply infinitely many other worlds in order to claim that you're offering a rational explanation of quantum physics, to me is, I mean, it's like bad metaphysics to me. I don't, not that I would affirm, whatever the standard interpretation of the quantum of the Copenhagen, the standard Copenhagen interpretation. I'm not necessarily wanting to affirm that. I've actually been more attracted recently to the transactional interpretation as developed by Ruth Kastner. I had a conversation with her about that a few weeks ago, where, we don't need to go too deep into this, but the idea of unitarity, maintaining unitarity, is what's motivating the many worlds interpretation. I think that the wave function never collapses, really. Whereas the transactional interpretation says, no, we should take our everyday experience of one world line seriously, and understand quantum physics to be describing a field of possibility that opens up between measurements. But, reality is this continual oscillation between actualization, opening out new potentialities, which then only one actuality one possibility rather gets actualized, and so there's a constant break of unitarity in our actual experience and in the actual unfolding of the world. But yeah, all that's to say, I find many worlds to be singularly unconvincing as an interpretation of quantum physics. I think it's rather absurd, actually. No offense to Sean Carroll or any followers of Everett. I mean, in terms of an abstract way of trying to resolve a conceptual problem, it's great. But when you try to bring that back into dialogue with our experience of the world and the presuppositions of conscious agency, which again, if we're not conscious agents making decisions to actualize certain possibilities and to not actualize others, then I don't know how science is even possible.
It's crazy. I was meant to chat to Ruth Kastner on the day after we initially were meant to speak, but due to technical difficulties for all those listening, Matt and I had a bit of an issue last week. Anyway, for any physicist or physicalist, let's say, that makes the claim that subjective experience is simply an illusion produced by the brain, let's say, what do you think is the strongest counter argument to this point? How would you address this as a main counter argument? What would be your go-to?
Well, I mean, strangely enough, I'm tempted to go back to Descartes and lean on the strength of his methodology here. I mean, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, he makes the compelling phenomenological case that, we know what we know best is our own subjective experience. And, he goes through this exercise of doubting everything that our senses tell us about the world, and even doubting everything that we think we know intellectually. He says, not only could I be deceived about my sensory experience of the world out there, the people, he's looking out his window at people walking on the street in their coats and hats. He's like, those could be automatons. I don't know for sure. I could be dreaming, and all of this is imagined. But even logical propositions, mathematical equations, he says I could be deceived that 5 + 5 = 10. I mean, maybe that's not true, and I only think it's true. But this demon is deceiving even my very cognitive process. But the one thing he says I could not doubt would be my own capacity to doubt, my own thinking activity. He says in Meditations, I think I am, and the syllogistic form of it, I think therefore I am, comes later. But this acquaintance, this intuitive access that we have to our own thinking activity is, I agree with Descartes. It's really the one feature of our experience that we can be most certain of. Mm-hmm. And so, like Descartes, I would say the scientific method, scientific rationality, scientific empiricism, science as such flows out of our capacity as thinking beings, right? And so if that is just an illusion, if our subjectivity is an illusion, well, then so is science. So is scientific knowledge. There is no such thing as knowledge if subjectivity is an illusion. And so it's quite a sort of pulling the rug out from under oneself type of maneuver to both want to affirm scientific knowledge, say a reductionistic understanding of the brain, and that the mind is just the activity of the brain. That is a performative self-contradiction in a way. You're undermining your very cognitive and epistemic capacity to make that claim when you deny that mind has any reality beyond just neurochemistry, right? If we can know the neurochemical correlates, roughly speaking, of consciousness, it's because our consciousness is capable of knowing that. I mean, what is knowledge if not an expression of the reality of our subjective experience? Knowledge has to, knowledge can't just be reduced to, vibrating molecules in the synapses of our neurons. It's a phenomenological activity in knowing, right? And so we have to be very, I think scientists should be more cautious about dismissing subjective experience, lest they saw the branch off that they're perched on.
Have you found that your exploration within this field, this anti-scientism, approach leads people to believe you're just anti-science.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. I get that a lot. I
I
love
get
science.
yeah, my same thing happens to me as a doctor. Just people just think I'm non-medical because I explore these consciousness topics, but it's heartbreaking when people think that they don't really understand the depth, I think, of the conversation.
It's a very anti-scientific attitude to take, like, allowed to criticize specific forms of um, or specific scientific claims. And I think it's also a matter of respecting the sort of division of labor, but the proper division of labor between philosophy and science. And there's this attitude that we don't need philosophy anymore. That's the scientistic attitude. And so those with this more scientistic approach, of course, are going to refer to anyone raising philosophical questions about science as anti-science, because, if you were properly scientific, you would realize that philosophy is of no use anymore. We've already answered all of the philosophical questions. Science has replaced philosophy, would be the attitude. And I think that's just dead wrong. There are so many questions that cannot be answered by empirical means, right? And science itself as a method is floating on top of a philosophical substructure, as it were, right? Like science in all of its successes and advances is just the very top of the iceberg, and below that is a deep history of philosophical reflection and justification that needs to be continually reworked and addressed as we make new scientific discoveries. And so there is an interplay and a conversation, a mutual transformation of science and philosophy, but we're always going to need to be asking philosophical questions that don't have straightforward scientific answers.
Well, at this point, let's move on to the paper again. I labeled the second chapter Panexperientialism and Organic Realism. Whitehead's organic realism contrasts with mechanistic materialism. How does it change the way we think about causality and the relationship between mind and matter in general?
So Whitehead introduces this term prehension, which is such a crucial concept in his philosophy of organism. And it has to do with causality, but it also has to do with perception and memory. In some sense, he's trying to come up with one concept that can explain various facets of reality to us. Since David Hume challenged the idea of necessary connection in nature, and as an empiricist, he said we don't have any experiential justification for this idea of necessary connection. And Kant read this and says famously that this awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. And Kant has to then say, oh, well, we can't do science without causality, so it must be an a priori category that we must interpret our experience in terms of. But the thing with Hume is, in his own account of why we are not aware of causality, that all we see is, one billiard ball hit another billiard ball, and the response of the second billiard ball to the force of the first, we think we know what's going to happen, but it's not a necessary connection. It's just because of our own psychological habits, our memories of having witnessed similar events in the past. We assume, and if through inductive generalization, we know what's going to happen next, but we don't actually know with any certainty. But the thing that Whitehead does that's so brilliant in reading Hume very carefully is Hume actually admits that we do have direct experience of causality when he says that we see with our eyes, we hear with our ears, this witness. Whitehead refers to it as the witness of the body. That, when you flick on a light switch in a dark room and your eyes blink, that is direct experience of causal efficacy, right? And so bodily feeling for Whitehead becomes the kind of prototype of causal transmission throughout nature, because he says, look, our living bodies are part of nature. They're just as much a part of the environment as anything else there, the mountain, a cloud, a river. And so what we feel subjectively, so to speak, as the transmission of feeling through our bodies, emotion and pain and pleasure, this must be in some sense analogous to how causality operates in the rest of nature, whether it's living nature or just physics and chemistry. That prehension for Whitehead is, I mean, it's synonymous with the closest synonym would just be feeling, right? That the causal transmission through nature is actually the transmission of feelings from what he would say is one occasion of experience to the next. And most of the enduring bodies that we see in the world around us, you know, tables and chairs and trees and other organisms, our own bodies, are actually what he would call societies of these occasions of experience. And the way that an enduring body maintains its form over time is by transmitting and repeating the same sorts of feelings over and over again, or definite characteristics over and over again. And so you get this very different picture of the natural world that is stitched together by these drops of experience that inherit from one another via prehension, which is again a kind of transmission of feeling or even emotion. So Whitehead thinks that the most primitive form of transaction in nature is actually emotion, blind emotion. He says it's not conscious self-reflection upon an emotional state. It's just the rush of emotion. And so not only does this put feeling back into nature, it also puts aim and purpose back into nature, right? So it's not just the motion of bodies. There's an emotional current that's drawing things forward to achieve certain goals. And Whitehead doesn't think that these goals are imposed from outside by some kind of designer. They're goals that arise from the desires of organisms themselves, right? So it's you could say it's Whitehead is deploying yet another example of this old Hermetic maxim, you know, as above, so below, as below, so above, but in some sense, as within, so without. And that's not really, you know, just Whitehead drawing on some, you know, ancient occult philosophical idea or something. I mean, you can understand Newton's approach to universal gravitation as abiding by the same Hermetic maxim, right? This is rooted deeply in science, and Whitehead's just applying it more thoroughly, right?
At some point, you suggest that physics must incorporate experience into its models. So the first thought that came to my mind was, what would physics that fully embraces a panexperientialism look like? Like what would that be? Is that something we could comprehend or prehend?
I mean, it wouldn't necessarily look all that different. What would be different would be our philosophical interpretation of all of these physical models that we have. Instead of thinking that, you know, based on Einstein's general relativity, that space-time really was this four-dimensional manifold or fabric, we would say, okay, that's a model, and ultimately what's real and what's concrete is going to need to be our experiential encounter with so-called space-time. And, you know, for Whitehead, the kind of geometry that we use to understand the physical world is somewhat a matter of convention. With geometry, we're always trying to make measurements. And depending on our purposes, one kind of measurement will be more valuable to us than another kind of measurement. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness, as he understands it, is what happens when we forget that whichever form of measurement we've chosen is an abstraction, and we we mistakenly concretize it and think, oh, that's the way nature really is. And so, physics and science, natural science is always going to be in the business of making models and testing models, throwing them up against reality and seeing how and where they break, and then fixing them and trying again. And that's tremendously useful. But I think to take a panexperientialist view of the universe, it doesn't so much change the everyday practice of natural science. I mean, it might raise certain ethical issues that would steer us away from certain kinds of experiments, because we're dealing with beings that can feel what we're doing to them. But I think overall, science would remain a kind of model building enterprise, but it would be situated within a broader philosophy of nature, wherein we recognize the difference between abstract models and concrete reality. And that in the most concrete sense, the universe would be understood to be more like an organism. And every scientific discipline and scientific model is dissecting that organism and taking a little slice of it, dyeing it and freezing it and sticking it under a microscope. And of course, we can learn a lot through those sorts of methods of reductionism, more or less. But that's a methodology and not an ontology. And so the problem is mistaking one for the other. And so, Whitehead's proposal here, or the philosophy of organism, is not trying to tell scientists doing their work that they need to totally change everything about their methodology. It's just step back and recognize the larger context here, and don't mistake the abstractions of your special science for the nature of concrete reality itself.
I think at some point that sort of links to Whitehead's idea of propositional feelings, because this is sort of going to reshape the way we think of models in reality. Would you like to unpack that a little?
Yeah. So, Whitehead's, he worked with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica, and they both really advanced this logic and developed propositional functions that, really opened up a whole new form of inquiry into the structure of thinking, the structure of language, and the structure of mathematics. But famously, the logicist project fails. Gödel proves why formally in the early 1930s with his incompleteness theorems. And even before Gödel, Whitehead was aware of the limitations of the attempt to, in a way, reduce all of mathematics to formal logical sort of deductions without the need for any intuitive leaps. That turned out not to work. And so Whitehead's left with a real desire to take logic as far as it can go, but he's recognizing that logicians have been so obsessed with the truth value of propositions, of logical propositions, that they've neglected the way that propositions function in the real world. And so what Whitehead ends up doing is he's generalizing the idea of a proposition beyond just a linguistic statement that a logician might judge as true or false. And instead, propositions become these entities. He would refer to them as hybrid entities that are somewhere between actuality and possibility. Propositions refer to actuality, but they refer to possibilities that are latent in actuality. And he would say that I think at least all living organisms have the capacity to feel propositions. And now, again, just to reiterate, these are not linguistic anymore. Whitehead would say our language and the structure of the grammar of various languages is an expression of the fact that there are propositional feelings at work deeper in our biology. And so any organism that can intend, in the sense of a phenomenological intentionality, an object is in some sense feeling a proposition, right? Because it's noticing, there's an entity out there that I am directing my attention toward, and that entity may have certain qualities, and each proposition is attributing certain qualities to that entity. Whitehead would refer to the logical subject of a proposition and then the predicative pattern. The logical subject is always other actual entities in the environment of the prehending entity or actual occasion, and the predicative pattern would be what he calls eternal objects. I'm laying out the technical details here in case anyone's a super nerd. But the idea here is that propositions allow organisms to both relate to the real world and to consider novel possibilities about that world. And these propositions themselves can propagate through the generations of organisms. And as new propositions enter into the world, they change that world, right? And so Whitehead will say it's more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. Right. Now, he adds that, of course, a true proposition tends to be more interesting, but not always. And it's the fact that propositions can enter into the experience of an organism and then become part of the world as a result of how they affect the behavior of that organism that allows novelty to enter the world. If we could only consider true propositions, our experience would always just conform to the past, right? And so truth as a conformal relationship to what has already occurred would leave us right where we started, right? But the fact that we can ingress novel propositions allows for a kind of evolutionary process. We can test out new possibilities, and if they work, the world is changed. Something new becomes true that wasn't true before. Right. So there's a lot to this theory of propositions, but hopefully that gives people a sense for the basic picture.
If there's anything further you'd like to unpack there, feel free.
Probably good for now. They can read the paper if they want more of the details.
I'll put the link down below. Tell me, Matt, if feeling is integral, to the structure of reality, does this suggest, I think I've asked a few people this before, but does this suggest that consciousness is sort of a fundamental force of reality, similar to gravity or electromagnetism? How do we view this from this perspective?
So Whitehead actually thinks consciousness as such is somewhat peripheral and derivative from a more primary form of experience. This is a stumbling block often for folks to think of non-conscious forms of experience. But that's what Whitehead is asking us to do. He wants to reserve the term consciousness for a particularly complex form of experience. He actually says that, again, I'll give the technical account he offers, that consciousness is the subjective form of a propositional feeling. And propositional feelings, like I said, are really only active in the world at the level of living organisms. It's not that there isn't feeling in the physical and chemical levels of reality, but it's not yet propositional in form, properly speaking, and so it's not yet conscious. And so what a proposition allows, again, right, is this contrast between actuality and possibility. Consciousness, similarly for Whitehead, it's all about the feeling of negation, he says, which is to say we become conscious to the degree that we're not only aware of what we're factually perceiving, but we're also aware of what could be perceived, but is not being perceived. So we're aware of the not, of the negative. And that absence is the space in which conscious and self-conscious experience arises. Most occasions of experience, including our own day-to-day and day-to-night, when you especially consider sleep, most of our experience is not conscious, but it's still experience. We wake up from a dream and we weren't conscious in the dream, but we remember having experienced something in the dream, right? And so I think similarly, when we're driving a car and we're talking to a friend in the passenger seat, we're not actually consciously attending moment by moment to the road. And in some sense, if we're overly conscious of every little maneuver we're making on the road, we're probably an anxious driver and not very safe, right? And so there's this deeper level of experience that's very much aware of what's going on, but isn't self-reflective about it. Flow states, so there are plenty of examples that I think help bring home this distinction Whitehead's making. And so for him, it's not consciousness that goes all the way down. It is this more basic form of feeling or experience or emotion. And And so that's a subtle distinction, but I think it helps avoid the charge of like anthropomorphism or something that Whitehead's just saying. Um, this high level human consciousness is somehow metaphysically fundamental. He's not saying that. Often, though, these words get used in different ways. And so when a lot of panpsychists who are coming at this approach from a non-Whiteheadian perspective say consciousness goes all the way down, they might in the end mean something similar to this more basic form of experience. So it might just be a verbal dispute, but I think these distinctions do carry some conceptual weight.
What do you think about it, Matt? How do you perceive consciousness? What do you think? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to. I do think I am a kind of theist. A panentheist or pangen theist, and to put the idea of genesis and evolution into that God world relationship. And so, on some level, I would want to understand the divine as a conscious being, but I think that consciousness, even the divine consciousness, is evolving and learning in the course of cosmogenesis. And so I guess in some ways that's not all that different from a kind of cosmopsychism, where instead of thinking of a bunch of little consciousnesses that might add up to bigger consciousness like our own, there's one consciousness that somehow divides itself. And I think, I'm not entirely comfortable with either of those pictures, but nonetheless, I do think that there is a kind of divine consciousness within which all of us and all of the universe exists as an expression of that consciousness. And so if we're going to talk about photons and electrons and atoms and these physical particles and the fields that they are excitations within as in some sense experiential, though not conscious, that doesn't mean that all of that isn't taking place within some kind of mega mind or world soul, if you want, right? So I wouldn't want to fully deny that consciousness is somehow very close to the ultimate nature of reality.
Have these always been your views, or do you feel that over the years, the influence of Whitehead, your religion, etc., have changed it and reshaped it in any ways, or has this been pretty much where you've been for quite some time?
My views have developed over the last, since I started philosophizing in any sense, the last 20 years now, I guess. I think I was initially more inclined towards this like Buddhist attitude, say in my late teens and early 20s, this Buddhist attitude of, metaphysics might be interesting, but let's focus more on alleviating suffering and becoming better people. And I still think that that's important, but I caught the speculative bug and I really wanted to know the answers to some of these questions. Whereas in my late teens, I thought, oh, this whole enlightenment thing sounds good. It can't be that hard. Let's give it a try. And it turned out that life is messy and difficult. And we can still strive to be better, more integrated people. But the idea of just, killing my ego and waking up one day and as an enlightened being seemed less realistic as I got a little older. And so these deeper metaphysical questions became more interesting to me. And I did discover Whitehead pretty early, like 22, 23, I started reading him. And, as much as I've tried to find places where I feel his scheme is inadequate, I really haven't been able to find anything more convincing. And so Whitehead has been very influential for me for quite a while now, and really shapes the structure of my thought. So I've been pretty consistent, I think, for a while. And I mean, the evidence is out there. I've been making YouTube videos forever. So anyone who wants to check to see if I've made any major shifts. I don't think so, though.
Yeah. I'll put a link to the channel as well because it's really enjoyable. Do you think that a pan-experientialist view is can allow for a scientifically coherent notion of free will?
I think so. Um, I mean, Whitehead's approach to panexperientialism implies that there's at least a modicum of creative, self-creative activity present at every scale in nature. And so there's no determinism in his universe. There's creative evolution, there's creative advance, and certainly there are more conformal, repetitive types of activity in nature. That's why there is order in the world. That's why we can develop in physics and chemistry laws. Though strictly speaking, in a Whiteheadian cosmology, laws are more like habits. But gravity is a widespread ancient habit that's very unlikely to change anytime soon. But nonetheless, it's a habit which has been acquired by the universe over the course of billions of years of cosmic evolution, and um, and so at the level of conscious animals like us, I think it's very clear that the capacity to make decisions that do not conform simply with the patterns of the past that's evident. It's part of what learning is all about, and whether or not a decision can be termed free in any ultimate sense, there's always going to be a tension between the conditions provided by the past and the possibilities open for realization in the future. We are constrained by the past. We're constrained by our physiology, but this in the same way that we can think of, say, our physiological constraints as holding us back, they're also affordances that provide us with an opportunity to freely decide to do certain things. And so we inherit not only limitations on our freedom, but we inherit capacities for making free decisions. I think the fact that animals evolved nervous systems is as a way of not just reacting to stimuli, but responding to stimuli, which is to say, on the basis of what has been learned over the course of a lifetime, animals with nervous systems can perform novel functions. And when you bring consciousness into play here, it's as if what consciousness adds to this more basic form of experience is like a dilation of time, wherein alternative possibilities can be considered before responding to whatever our perception is giving us from the environment. And so a conscious human being has this imaginative capacity to explore various possibilities and to even develop motivations by considering certain images. And there's not just a direct connection between an image that we're considering and an action that we take. We have to have like the willpower to act on an image or an idea. And so there are several, it's making a free decision is not necessarily the easiest. It's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world to do, but nonetheless, I think there's a pathway for us to do so. And it's a kind of hardcore common sense presupposition that we have agency. We value the truth. That's a conscious decision that we make as scientifically inclined minds, you know? And so if we don't have any freedom, again, I don't know that we can take science seriously anymore. I think science presupposes conscious agency. Yeah.
Overall, what it seems like to me is that your work seems to be trying to unify scientific rigor with lived experience. And ultimately, how do you see this? Or how can we do this in the best way possible? I mean, how can philosophers and scientists collaborate to break down these barriers and make this more interdisciplinary? Is that what partly Footnotes to Plato is for, or your work in general? Is that an attempt in itself? And what else do you think we could do? Because that's also fundamentally what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, so if we look at, the last century and a half of the way that science has developed as a profession, I think there are many ways in which the professionalization of science has led to more rigor and more precision, and the development of journals with jargons that allow for this really deep penetration into ever more specialized modes of inquiry. And all of that's important and valuable, but at the same time, this professionalization has created a culture of competition for funding, for prestige. And the thing about science, in its origins, it was something that, there weren't yet university departments where you got slotted into to do a specific kind of research. People like Newton or Darwin, they're exploring based on where their imagination drew them. And I think I know Darwin was, maybe Newton was too, sort of independently wealthy, and so of course funding wasn't an issue. But as science becomes more and more professionalized, it gets co-opted by other values, economic values, military values. Military funding was already a factor in the birth of science in the 17th century. I mean, Galileo and Descartes were working on ballistics to pay the bills. They were, Galileo and Kepler and those guys were also doing astrology to pay the bills, but that's another matter. The history of science is way more interesting than most people let on. But in any event, I think one way to improve the collaborative spirit among scientists themselves and among scientists and philosophers is to remember that knowledge is part of the commons. And I think science has been really co-opted and harmed by being captured by market forces and being captured by government and militaristic aims and as well. And we really need to shift into a different understanding of what knowledge is, to break it free of this competitive market type of attitude where, it's all about making sure my lab is the best and I get all the credit and I get all the funding and we're going to defeat our competitors. How are we going to advance when that's the motivation? This leads to, actually diverging from the value of truth to fudge the numbers a little bit to maybe get a little bit more funding and prestige. You see that happening. If we can shift to a more collaborative approach to the production of knowledge, this has a lot to do with shifting of the funding structure, to think of it, more as gift money that would be funding research rather than money from some corporation that has a specific end in mind. Like, look, we put a lot of money into this drug. You better design a study so that it works, rather than in an open-minded way, exploring different forms of medicine without the profit motive driving it all, which obviously distorts things. And so I think this professionalization of science and philosophy, which has occurred over the last 150 years or so, while it did bring some benefits, has actually fragmented knowledge and distorted it, right? Because of these other motivations that have come into the picture.
How does your view address existential concerns, existential dread, in a world where the scientific mainstream view is that of a cold, dead, indifferent universe.
Yeah. Well, I think this scientific materialist view, like this sort of heroic atheism, is motivating enough for some people, like Sean Carroll, Richard Dawkins. Like there's this attitude. Jacques Monod would talk about us as sort of like lonely gypsies on a mote of dust in some random place at the edge of the galaxy. That attitude of being alone in a meaningless world and nonetheless like soldiering on. For some people, that is a source of meaning. It's a kind of narrative that motivates them, and it's in its own way a kind of myth, another version of the hero's journey. And so I understand how it functions, but I think it only functions because it has that mythic structure to it. But it's still that myth, though it can be a source of meaning for some. I think it's still alienating. I think it inevitably disconnects us from deeper sources of meaning. We end up having to say that we make up our own meaning. And, you know, I pick on Sean Carroll a little bit because he thinks that it's a little easier to make up our own meaning than it actually is. I think very few of us are satisfied just thinking that all of our values are subjective preferences. And actually, if we, consider this politically, if you're a kind of secular atheist and a political liberal, you would say, well, the values of liberalism, like classical liberalism, like, human rights and freedom of speech and all this, we all reasonable people agree and have that preference that we should protect these rights. And it turns out that subjective preference as a basis for these rights might not actually be all that secure, as we see in our current world. Without any deeper anchor for these values, they're very easily uprooted and replaced by those with beliefs in what's being called the strong gods. In this Nietzschean sense that there are these elemental powers that are the source for human values, and that while we do play a participatory role as human beings, nonetheless, our values are sourced more deeply in our biology, if we're going to just be materialist about it. But also, I think in a Whiteheadian sense, beyond just our biology and these sort of Darwinian drives, there are these deeper cosmic values. Nietzsche would think of it in terms of the will to power, and there's something similar in Whitehead, but for Whitehead, power is always the power of composition. It's this power for Whitehead is rooted in an aesthetic desire to compose experience in a way that makes it more beautiful, more intensely beautiful. And so, I think we're better served by recognizing that our human values are actually derivative from the deeper values of life, the deeper values of evolution writ large, and that these aren't just negative values in the sense that it's just the struggle for existence then, and those with the most brutal values to encourage strength and being the best warrior or whatever, that those are the only values that end up winning out. No, I think there are more delicate values too that we inherit from these deeper cosmic processes that are more geared towards, again, beauty and subtlety and compassion and wisdom and love and so on, and that these aren't just human constructs. These are actually why there even are human beings. Like the fact that the human being evolved as a conscious agent capable of scientific knowledge, capable, not always actualizing it, but capable of wisdom and love and compassion and so on. I think that's evidence of the fact that, the universe has these more deeply rooted tendencies in it, right? And so I don't know that it's ultimately responsible for scientists and intellectuals who themselves have been able to find meaning in one of these materialist stories by virtue of the heroism that it affords them, um, as like little drops of meaning in a soulless world. I think it's irresponsible to try to push that on the average person, because the average person who's not, you know, um, who doesn't have a life whereby a narrative about being involved in the production of scientific knowledge and so on can be enough to motivate them and give them meaning. I think it actually really puts us in a dangerous situation culturally of nihilism. And Nietzsche warned us what would happen if nihilism took root and became widespread. And that was the 20th century. And quarter into the 21st century, we're still dealing with the same problem, I think.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about your work? Or about, at least about the way people perceive your work?
Well, I think you hit on something earlier when, you said people tend to view this as anti-scientific. That's not at all my intention. I don't think it's borne out when you consider the work that I have done, trying to support the advance of science and the find better justifications actually for science, to save science from its own self-annihilation and its own performative, the performative self-contradictions of scientism, that undermines its own conditions of possibility. I think, people who are more religious in a traditional way will criticize me for not having the right understanding of God. Just as people with a more materialist or atheist bent will criticize me for the irrational belief in any kind of a God. And so it depends. The biggest misconception depends on where the other person is coming from. I often think of myself as an integrative philosopher. I'm trying to find the middle path between various extremes. I think in some ways everybody is right about something, and so there's something to learn from every position and from every view. And I wouldn't want to be too quick to dismiss alternatives, but I think whenever we find ourselves in a situation of having to explain away inconvenient facts, we know that we're caught in some kind of extreme ideological view or an imbalanced perspective. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest misconception is that I'm just trying to invent a view of the universe that brings me comfort. Whereas, I often say like the panexperientialist or panpsychist view is actually not comforting at all. It's kind of frightening to imagine that the world is imbued with sentience, and that it's not just me looking at the world, but the world is looking back. I mean, it's kind of unsettling. It's not comforting, I have to say. It does, put us back in an ecology of a world that's more like an ecology of organisms than it is just a collection of objects. But like literal ecology, that means, there are predators out there who might want to eat us. And so I think the world that I'm describing is not simply one where I would feel more comfortable, but it is one where I would feel more meaningful.
Well, speaking of meaning, if you had to take this view to its max, its teleology of the universe, meaning, purpose, where does it head for you?
I don't know, in particular where it's headed, but this is an interesting difference between a thinker like Whitehead and the Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. whose work I also love, but I'm less comfortable with his almost deterministic view of where evolution is headed. That it seems to him almost inevitable that the evolution of life on Earth would have culminated in thought or in the conscious human being, which then is this new threshold of evolution. Teilhard refers to the human being as a new kingdom of life, not just a new species. And the human is really bringing forth what he calls the noosphere, or the layer of mind around the planet, and that evolution then continues towards what he refers to as Christogenesis, and the emergence of the omega point, which for him almost like pierces through space-time and unifies life and mind with the divine. And that, for him, there's this inevitable curvature of the evolutionary process toward this omega point. And I admit it's a beautiful and compelling vision, but I'm not sure that there's that much determination to this process. Whitehead is more open-ended about where evolution is going, but he would say, and I'm think more inclined to agree with Whitehead's perspective here, that there's a general telos towards more beauty, where beauty is the capacity to hold more diversity and harmony, right? To bring together what might otherwise be conflicts into contrasts. And so the universe is moving always towards more intense expressions of beauty, of aesthetic enjoyment. And with the capacity for more aesthetic enjoyment also comes the capacity for more pain and suffering, right? But it seems as though the possibility of joy and deeper beauty is worth it, despite the risks of greater pain and suffering. Otherwise, like, why would the evolution of life on Earth produced more and more sensitive creatures capable of more and more existential dread, like as the downside to being such highly organized and sensitive creatures? It seems that the joy and the experience of beauty afforded by our very sensitive type of organization, again, is worth it despite the downsides. And so that general tendency towards more complexity, more capacity to experience beauty seems to me to be at least providing a trajectory without there having to be a definite end point that we will reach no matter what.
Have you ever considered renaming your channel Footnotes to Whitehead?
I mean, in some sense, because that's a quote from Whitehead, it's kind of already there for those in the know who know where that quote comes from. But Whitehead says he's really only adapting Plato's view in light of modern science, and that, in some sense, Plato laid out all of the problematics, all of the approaches to perennial problems, some solutions that he offers, but then he also critiques his own solutions. In the dialogues, you get all of these great doctrines and the best refutations of those doctrines. And so, in many ways, Whitehead's already returning to Plato, but in the spirit of Plato himself, in open-ended inquiry and not becoming dogmatically attached to any particular doctrine, but just trying to, again, integrate the variety of facts with the most inclusive theoretical interpretations of those facts.
Schelling, Whitehead, Kant, great philosophers, Plato. Who else would you recommend for the average listener viewer to make sure they read before they leave this world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I find Ralph Waldo Emerson to be quite edifying in the Platonist lineage, and he's such a wonderful essayist who can convey the deepest insights of not just the tradition of Western philosophy, but Indian philosophy as well, in an idiom that, at least for an English speaker, I think is quite accessible and beautiful. Everyone should read Nietzsche just to understand our predicament. And it's very important to confront nihilism and not bypass that. And so any reenchantment project or attempt to revitalize a meaningful connection to the cosmic process has to come after nihilism, not before. We can't retreat from the confrontation with, what Nietzsche is describing. Yeah, who else? What else would I say? I mean, it's good to read some poetry. Rilke and uh, Holderlin and um, Wordsworth and Shelley and Whitman. These are all important for me. And I don't read much fiction. I'm often reading science and philosophy books, but I do read poetry as often as I can, because I think it keeps my language fresh. It helps me avoid becoming overly formalist in finding jargon and sticking with it forever. I think there's a way of writing philosophy where you can get locked into particular formulations, and then they just become these mantras that gradually lose their meaning. And on the other hand, people might complain, "Oh, but you're so slippery. You're constantly describing it in different ways, and like I'm not even sure what you mean because you never say it the same twice." It's like, well, the concepts I'm trying to direct your attention to are not identical to the words that I'm using to direct you. And so, learning to think is, I think, is a poetic process because you find out gradually, the deeper you go into this conceptual territory, um, that in different moments of life and with different audiences and different contexts, it is best to use different words to describe the same concepts, right? And that way you avoid ever collapsing the two and imagining that concepts are just words, because I don't think they are. I can't tell you what they are because I could only use words to do so, but I think there is some kind of a tension there between whatever a concept is and the linguistic formulations we use to convey them. So poetry is important to keep our language fluid, I think.
I think that your work's incredible. It's enjoyable to watch. Your channel's great. And having you as a guest has been such a pleasure. I would be remiss if I don't mention, though, that we were meant to chat, I think, a few months ago. And due to my recent move, unfortunately, several technical issues happened. I had to postpone a couple of interviews. But one of those was not just ours, but our group interview for Mind at Large. Peter Shusted Hughes, we spoke about this concept, this huge conference that's happening in December. Hope we can actually going to attend as well. But what can you tell me about this Mind at Large? What's going on here? What are you guys up to? Give us some info. Give us the deets.
Yeah, no, I can spill some of the beans on that. So myself and Peter and the good folks at the Center for Process Studies, Andrew Davis and Andrew Schwartz, as well as Alex Gomez Marin from the Perry Center, and others. We're assembling a larger team. We're planning this multi-year project that will be primarily a series of conferences. I think we have 3 in mind, and we want to tell a story over the course of 3 years in these conferences, describing, first of all, how did we get here to this inflection point where we have more knowledge of the universe than ever before, and yet was it Steven Weinberg who said the more we know about the universe, the less meaningful it seems. Why is that? Why is that the story that we have ended up telling as our knowledge of the universe has increased? Why wouldn't we tell a different kind of story where we're amazed by the fact that the universe is intelligible at all and that we're capable of decoding its structure, its logical physical structure. And so we want to understand how we got here. And we want to explore the variety of alternatives to materialism that are all of a sudden back on the table. Various forms of idealism, various forms of panpsychism and animism. Vitalism is cool again in some form. And so we want to create a forum where all of these alternatives can come together with whoever among the materialists and physicalists is willing to join us to, hold down the fort, as it were, against a lot of challenge and opposition. But in a friendly, collaborative, collegiate way, we want to convene these conversations to try to, create the menu basically for the 21st century of philosophical options, because it's very clear that at least the organizers, myself and the other organizers of this project, feel that materialism is on the back foot right now. And so we want to seize the moment, as it were, and bring to greater public awareness some of the alternatives, which I think have actually scientific justification and philosophical basis. And we're not trying to tilt the scales towards one position or the other of these alternatives, but we really want to just allow for an open-ended inquiry. And so there will be conferences where we're even considering sort of documentary that might come out of this that tells the story in a compelling way. So we've got a little bit of funding. We're looking for more, but it's going to happen. It's happening. So I hope you're going to be a part of it as well.
Yeah, I am. I tell Peter, if he needs any help at all, my Embody Solution, we're here to help. I'm here to. I'm probably going to attend. So looking forward to it, and I can't wait to see this. And I think the one important thing that you said there is the alternatives, because it shows that there's a lack of a personal attempt to try and put your own view forward, which is great, because while you might be saying you're going anti-materialist, it's great that you guys are going to all be exploring different and diverse views about this, which I think is pretty cool, and it's always a great sign. So yeah, Matt, thanks. This has been such a pleasure to chat to you, man.
Yeah, likewise, Tevin. Great questions. Glad we could finally make it work.
Yeah, me too. It's been a long time coming, but I'm hoping this year, hopefully we see each other soon in person. And all you guys, because I think I've been interacting with you guys for so long, and now I've chatted to you. I think it's time to meet some of you guys in person. I'm all the way in Cape Town, so it's so far away. It's your morning, it's my night. So
yeah. Well, the idea is, I think we're thinking we might have one conference in California, one in New York, and then one in your hemisphere somewhere. If not in Africa, at least in Europe.
Well, if the closer the better, but I'll make my way either way. So I'm looking forward to it. Any final words, Matt? Anything you feel like you need to say before we leave, or are you happy with everything?
I would just say trust your experience. And, so much of what we've discussed is just about this dilemma we found ourselves in, where certain abstract forms of modeling and reasoning have alienated us from our own direct experience and encounter with the universe. And I think the way forward is to go back to our direct encounter with the world and then build out from there more carefully, and less in a rush to predict and control, but with rather the intention to come into deeper relationship with that world.